Shabbat Shalom. So I want to talk a little bit about this week's Torah portion and one big issue it brings up for me that I think might speak to you all as well. So this week's Torah portion is called Vayigash, and Sebastian, I'm sure you're going to be talking about it a bit tomorrow as well. Hopefully I won't steal your flame a little bit. And I think there's a lot to be said about it. So I think you'll definitely say a lot about it too. It is what I would say probably the climax of the book of Genesis, and definitely the climax of the story of the four fathers and four mothers, right? So we have Abraham, who gives birth to Isaac, and there's some sibling rivalry in there between Isaac and Ishmael, and then we have Isaac, who gives birth to Jacob and Esau, and Jacob and Esau have a little sibling rivalry that goes on between the two of them. And Jacob steals the blessing from his brother Esau, and he fools his father, and he runs away, and he works for a man named Lavan for 7 years to get the permission to marry his daughter, Rachel, and all of a sudden he goes to marry her, and it turns out he's married the wrong woman. So then he has to work another 7 years for Rachel, because he was now married to Leah. And then he has children, and he has children with Leah, but Rachel is unable to have children until finally Rachel gives birth to a son, to Joseph. And often we learn what not to do from the forefathers and the foremothers. And what we learned not to do in this case is to have favoritism for our children, because Jacob favored Joseph. He gave him a coat. Some people say it's a coat of many colors. Some say it's a beautiful embroidered coat. And his brothers were jealous. And he also had these dreams that everybody was bowing down to him, and he told his brothers, which is another thing maybe to learn not to do, is to tell people when you're having dreams that they're all bowing down to you. And so the brothers sell Joseph into slavery in Egypt. And he ends up down in Egypt, and through a series of interesting turns, Joseph ends up the advisor to the Pharaoh, and there's a famine in the land. And the brothers come down to Egypt to see if they can get some food. And lo and behold, they walk in front of Joseph. And Joseph, they don't know that it's Joseph. And Joseph sort of tricks them and tests them and says that they have to bring Benjamin, who's the other child who was favored of Rachel. And they bring Benjamin, and he challenges them to say, you can all leave, but you have to leave Benjamin with me. And Judah steps forward, and he says, no way. This whole thing is going to end here, this whole sibling rivalry. I'm going to stand in place of my brother, and if you're going to take somebody, take me. And sort of he ends this whole cycle that's been happening through the book of Genesis. But what I'd like to focus on today is in that moment, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and he says something very interesting. He says to his brothers, they're worried that he's going to be upset with them. He says, don't be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me into slavery. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. And then later he says, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made he has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of all his household, and ruler over the whole land of Egypt. And it would seem that Joseph is saying to his brothers, you know what? This all happened for a reason. The whole thing, don't worry about it. It all happened for a reason. And it would seem almost a simplistic statement of that. Like, oh, don't worry about it. Everything happens for a reason. This is the reason. I'm totally fine with all of this. And my question, which I want to sort of explore for a couple of minutes, is, does everything happen for a reason? Is that true in life? Is that what Joseph was saying, or was he saying something else to his brothers? And I'd like to first offer a sort of extreme example. There was the Jewish tradition deals with this question, obviously, right? We deal with these kinds of questions all the time. There was an example of an early rabbinic sage, an early rabbi, whose name was Nachum Gamzu. And the reason they called him Nachum Gamzu is because he used to go around saying, Gamzu Litova, which means this too is for the good. And they said that he would always go around everything that happened to him. He would say, Gamzu Litova, Gamzu Litova. This is for the good, this is for the good. And he even had a student named Rabbi Akiva. Anybody hear of Rabbi Akiva before? Rabbi Akiva was probably his most famous student. And Rabbi Akiva sort of inherited this way of being from Nachum Gamzu. And there's a story that one day Rabbi Akiva was traveling on his donkey, and he used to bring a candle so he could study Torah by the candlelight. And he used to have a rooster that he would carry with him that would wake him up in the morning so that he could get up early and study Torah and walk on his way. And the story goes that he was going to a town, and he stopped at the town looking for a place to stay, and everybody in the town turned him away, and they said, you can't stay here. So he ended up camping out, like a little bit away from the town. And he was camping out, and he lit his candle, and it just kept going out, and it just kept going out. And finally, he gave up because the candle wouldn't stay lit, and he was very upset. And then in the middle of the night, the story goes that a big cat came and ate his rooster. And then another big animal came and ate his donkey. And he was so sad and he was so upset. But he said, like his teacher, Nachum Gamzu, this too is for the good. This has to be for the good. And he woke up in the morning and he saw that the town that wouldn't let him in was in flames, and that it had been destroyed and ransacked by people. And then he said to himself, well, I guess that was the reason. If my light had been lit, they would have seen me and they would have come and attacked me. If my donkey had been making noise, they would have come and attacked me. And if my rooster had been making noise, they would have come and attacked me. So of all of this, everything that's happened, it was all for the good. And the story goes that he said, everything God does is for the best. Are things that simple? Are things that simple? I don't think so. Not for me in my life. And not even for Akiva, who we learn later on in another story, that he died a very tragic death by the hands of the Romans. A death that was beyond reason and beyond meaning. Very, very, very deep suffering that he experienced. And there's a story that Moses from the Torah went and traveled in time and was shown Akiva's death and shown how great of a man Akiva was. And he said to God, why did this happen to such a great man? And God's response is, shtok, which means basically, shut up. Kachala b'machshava, that's the way it's supposed to be. And that's what we hear from God in that instance. So this is the man, Rabbi Akiva, who said everything's for the good, everything is according to God's will, but it's unclear here whether that's actually how his end played out. And in my life as well, events aren't that simple. 3 months ago tonight, my father-in-law died tragically. And my children asked me after he died, why did this happen? And I said, I don't have a reason. There is no reason. There is no reason for this. And sometimes that's what you say. You have to remain silent. There is no reason. Now, when I told them that I was going to give this talk tonight, last week, my son said to me, always challenging me, my children, I'm sure your children do the same, right? My son said to me, so you're giving this talk that everything happens for a reason. So what was the reason that Grandpa died? And they said, is there a reason? I said, well, no, but we can give meaning to his death after the fact. We can give it a reason. And there's another story I wanted to bring up. This is actually a Buddhist story. I don't know if people know, but I'm a Jewish Buddhist. So there's a story about a Buddhist farmer. And he has this beautiful horse, and the horse runs away. And his neighbor comes by, and his neighbor said, oh my gosh, how horrible that is. Your horse ran away. And he says, maybe. And then the next day, the horse comes back with 4 beautiful wild stallions. And the neighbor sees this, and he says, oh, how fortunate for you. Now you have 5 horses. This is amazing. This is wonderful news. And the farmer says, maybe. And then the next day, his son was trying to break one of the horses and ride one of the horses and was thrown from the horse and broke his leg. And his neighbor came by and he said, oh, how horrible this is. Your son broke his leg. This is such a tragic turn of events. And the farmer said, maybe. And then the next day, the story goes that soldiers came to conscript people who were able-bodied into the army. And they came to conscript his son, and his son had a broken leg, so they didn't conscript him into the army. They didn't draft him. And the neighbor saw this, and he said, how wonderful. Your son was saved from having to serve in the army. And the farmer said, maybe. And you can imagine that the story would go on, but that's actually the end. That's the way they end the story in the Buddhist tradition. And I think, for me, that's a lot closer than the Gamzu L'Tova story, that everything happens for a reason. When I think of this question, I think of the fact that we give meaning to life. And there's a famous quote from Shakespeare which says, there is neither good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It's from Hamlet. And there's another quote in Judaism which is, Hakol bidei shamayim chutz mi'irat shamayim, that everything's in the hands of God except for the fear of God. There was a famous Holocaust survivor named Viktor Frankl who wrote, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance, to choose one's own way. I'd like to suggest that the bad things that happen to us in our lives do not have a meaning when they happen to us. They do not happen for any good reason, which would cause us to accept them willingly. But we can give them meaning. We can redeem tragedies from senselessness by imposing meaning upon them. Viktor Frankl again said, in some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. Which brings me back to Joseph. So later on, after Jacob dies, the brothers are afraid that Joseph was just saying, you know what, everything happens for a reason, because he wanted to make things okay with the father. But the father dies, and the brothers come back to Joseph and after burying Jacob, and they're worried that he really didn't mean it. And they say, what if Joseph still bears a grudge against us? And they go to Joseph and they bow down to him. They say, we're your slaves, we'll do anything, please forgive us. And here's what he said. He said, although you intended me harm, God intended it for good, so as to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. The way I interpret this is that what happened to Joseph was senseless and tragic until Joseph made meaning out of it. That meaning being that it ultimately enabled him to provide for the survival of his people. I'd like to end by saying that the Jewish tradition calls us to do as Joseph did, to make meaning, to grow lotuses out of mud, as Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh might say. Ultimately, Viktor Frankl wrote, ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. Amidst all of the difficulties and turmoil and suffering that we face in life, may we be blessed to be able to answer life's question to us and thereby find solace in the face of chaos. Shabbat Shalom.